Her hand hovered over the contract, and for one fragile, trembling heartbeat, the entire world seemed to stop breathing with her. The pen between her fingers was nothing more than metal and ink, something small and ordinary, yet in that moment it felt impossibly heavy, like it carried the weight of every decision that had led her here. The boardroom around her was cold in the calculated way only rooms built for power ever felt cold. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the rainy skyline, and the city stretching out below like a restless ocean of lights. 30 floors down, cars moved, people rushed home, lives continued without interruption. But up here, everything was still. The marble table gleamed under soft white lights, reflecting the silent tension in the room. Even the rain sliding slowly down the windows seemed quieter, as if the storm itself understood that something irreversible was about to happen. Across the table sat Cornell Pierce, billionaire, corporate prince. A man whose name carried the kind of influence that opened doors before he even reached them. He leaned back in his chair like he had nothing to prove to anyone in the room, like he owned not just the company, not just the building, but the air everyone else was breathing. One arm rested lazily against the polished surface of the table, his fingers tapping once, slowly, as if time itself moved according to his patience. There was something unsettling about the calm confidence in his posture. Not arrogance, exactly. Something quieter, more dangerous. The stillness of a man who watched everything and revealed almost nothing. She had studied him before coming here. Every photograph, every interview, every reckless headline splashed across gossip magazines about the infamous Pierce heir who partied too hard, fought too publicly, and never seemed to care what the world thought about him. She had built an image of him in her mind, wild, careless, spoiled by wealth and power. But the man sitting across from her now was different from the man in those photographs. The pictures had captured the expensive suits, the careless smirks, the dark eyes that reporters called dangerously charming. What they had never captured was the quiet intensity in those eyes when they rested on someone for longer than a second. They never showed how he watched people the way a chess player studies a board, slowly, thoughtfully, calculating moves no one else could see yet. And right now, those eyes were on her, watching, waiting. A slow smile curved the corner of his mouth, like he could see the hesitation she was trying so hard to hide. "Relax," he murmured, his voice low and calm, the kind of voice that never needed to rise to be heard. "It's only a marriage contract." Only a marriage contract. The words drifted across the table and landed between them like a quiet challenge. Her fingers tightened around the pen. If only he knew how absurd that sentence truly was. And because the man sitting across from her had absolutely no idea who she really was. No idea that the woman his legal team had vetted so carefully, the polished resume, the spotless background, the perfectly ordinary life story, was nothing more than a carefully constructed mask. No idea that 3 years ago she had stood in the cold rain at a cemetery staring down at 2 fresh graves, while reporters whispered about financial collapse and corporate betrayal. No idea that the last name carved into those headstones had once meant everything to her, and that the last name Pierce had been the one that destroyed it. She remembered that morning clearly, the smell of wet soil, the sound of rain tapping against the black umbrella someone had handed her, the numbness that had settled in her chest when she realized that grief could be so heavy it silenced even the instinct to cry. That was the moment she had made herself a promise. Not out loud. Not with drama. Just a quiet vow whispered somewhere deep inside her chest where no one else could hear it. One day, she would walk into the world that had crushed her family, and she would take back every single thing that had been stolen. Not with anger, not with desperation, but slowly, carefully, patiently. And now here she was, sitting across from the son of the man who had started it all, holding the one signature that would open the door she had been trying to reach for years. Cornell Pierce leaned forward slightly, his gaze still locked on her face, as if he were trying to read the thoughts she refused to show him. There was curiosity there, amusement, maybe even a hint of admiration for the way she had managed to stay so calm. What he saw was a woman considering a business arrangement. What he didn't see was the storm behind her steady expression, the anger she had learned to fold neatly away, the grief that had hardened into something colder and sharper than tears. This marriage was supposed to be simple, temporary, strategic. A public arrangement designed to clean up his reputation and stabilize certain corporate negotiations that required him to look respectable for once in his life. On paper, it was nothing more than a calculated partnership between two adults who both understood the rules. But to her, this was the first move in a very different game. The pen lowered slowly until the tip touched the paper. The moment stretched out like a held breath. And then, with one steady motion, Summer Lawson signed her name across the bottom of the contract. The ink glided smoothly across the page. No shaking, no hesitation. Just one elegant signature that legally bound her life to the man sitting across from her. When she finished, she placed the pen down gently beside the document and slid the contract back across the table. Just like that, it was done. She was now Mrs. Cornell Pierce. A silence settled over the room again, heavier than before. For a brief moment, Cornell looked down at the signature on the page. Then he looked back up at her. And for the smallest fraction of a second, so quick most people would have missed it, something shifted in his expression. The playful smirk faded. The mask cracked just enough to reveal something real underneath it. Not arrogance, not amusement, something quieter, something almost relieved. As if he had been waiting a very long time for someone who wouldn't run away from the deal sitting between them. Then the smirk returned, smooth and effortless, like that fleeting moment had never happened at all. But she had seen it, and something about that brief flash of honesty unsettled her more than anything else that had happened in this room. Because revenge was supposed to be simple. Revenge was supposed to be cold and clean and controlled. Yet as she sat there across from the man she had planned to destroy from the inside, an uncomfortable thought crept quietly into the back of her mind. Plans are easy when people behave exactly the way you expect them to. But Cornell Pierce didn't feel predictable. And deep down, somewhere she didn't want to acknowledge yet, she had the uneasy feeling that the moment she signed that contract, the game she thought she was playing had just become something far more complicated than revenge. 3 months before that signature, Summer Lawson belonged to no one. No ring, no shared last name, no billionaire husband watching her from across polished tables. She was just a woman sitting alone in a small apartment at 2 in the morning, under the dull yellow glow of a single desk lamp that made the whole room feel smaller than it was. The rest of the apartment was dark and quiet. The kind of quiet that only shows up long after midnight when the city outside finally starts to slow down. A cup of coffee sat beside her elbow, long since gone cold, forgotten hours earlier when her mind had locked onto the same trail of thoughts it had followed almost every night for the past 3 years. In front of her, covering nearly the entire wall, was a corkboard filled with printed documents, photographs, scribbled notes, and thin strands of red string stretching from one pin to another like veins under skin. Names connected to numbers, numbers connected to locations. Meetings linked to contracts, contracts tied back to people who had never once in their lives considered that a quiet woman sitting in a dim apartment might be studying the shape of their decisions. At the center of it all was one name circled in thick black ink so many times the paper beneath it had started to tear. Dan Pierce. The knot everything else led back to. the man whose shadow had stretched across her life long before she ever learned his face. Summer's parents had been ordinary people, the kind of people the world moves past without noticing, even though the world would fall apart without them. Her father fixed things for a living. Buildings that leaned too far to the left. Old bicycles that kids swore were beyond saving. Sometimes even people who had stopped believing they were worth the effort. He had a way of looking at broken things like they weren't broken forever, just waiting for someone patient enough to understand how they were built. Her mother taught literature at a small college across town. She owned too many books, folded the corners of pages instead of using bookmarks, laughed too loudly at her own jokes, and believed deeply that stories mattered because they reminded people who they were when life tried to convince them otherwise. They were not powerful people. They didn't know politicians. They didn't sit on corporate boards or appear in business magazines. They were simply good in the quiet, consistent way good people tend to be, without audience, without applause, because kindness was the only language they had ever known how to speak. And on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning in March, they drove past a Pierce Holdings construction site on their way to breakfast. The scaffolding collapsed at 8:42 a.m. It had already failed 3 internal safety inspections in the previous 6 weeks. The investigation lasted 11 days. 11 days before the language started changing, before the early witness statements quietly disappeared from the report, before the construction supervisor who had raised concerns stopped returning calls. Before a legal team arrived at Summer's door carrying condolences wrapped inside paperwork and a settlement that looked generous to someone too young and too shattered to understand what she was being asked to sign. She signed it anyway. At 19 years old, grief is loud and overwhelming and confusing. You sign things because adults in expensive suits say it will help you move forward. You sign things because the alternative feels impossible to understand. It wasn't until 8 months later, when the fog of loss finally began to thin, that she realized what that document had really done. They hadn't just taken her parents. They had paid her to stay silent about it. Paid her to bury the questions that should have been asked. Paid her to accept the official story and walk away from the truth. They had taken her grief and returned it to her, wrapped in legal language that turned her into part of their silence. That was the moment the grief changed. It hardened. And what had once been pain slowly reshaped itself into something colder, something sharper, something that pointed in a direction. Summer spent the next 2 years digging through every public record she could access, quietly, methodically. The same way her father used to approach structural problems when a building started showing cracks. You don't tear everything down immediately. You test the load-bearing points first. You learn how the weight moves through the structure. Because if you pull the wrong piece too early, the whole thing collapses in chaos instead of truth. She traced financial filings that didn't quite match internal reports. She found former employees who agreed to speak off the record until suddenly they didn't anymore. She found evidence that had been cleaned so carefully it almost looked perfect, which was the problem. Nothing real is ever that clean. When people erase things that thoroughly, it means there was something worth hiding in the first place. By the end of those 2 years, she didn't have proof strong enough to bring down a corporation. But she had something almost as valuable. She had the outline of the truth. The problem was access. Every road she followed eventually ran into the same wall. Pierce Holdings. Layers of security. Lawyers. Executives who never answered questions directly. She could see the structure of the lie, but she had no way inside the building that protected it. Then one Thursday evening, her phone rang. Thursdays always felt strange to her. Her mother used to call every Thursday night without fail just to talk about whatever book she was reading. The silence of that missing call had never stopped feeling unnatural. So when the phone rang that night, she almost ignored it. But she answered. A recruitment agency. Polite voice. Professional tone. A client needed a consultant. Crisis management experience preferred. Someone capable of handling a difficult personality in a high-stakes family environment. 6-month assignment. When the name of the client was mentioned, Summer went completely still. The kind of stillness that doesn't mean calm. Dan Pierce. The assignment wasn't actually for him. It was for his son, Cornell Pierce. She asked for 48 hours to consider the offer. The recruiter agreed. For 2 days, she didn't sleep much. She stood in front of the corkboard for hours, staring at the red threads connecting every piece of information she had spent 2 years gathering. Her eyes kept drifting back to the name in the center of it all. The name she had been circling around like a planet locked in orbit around something it could never quite reach. And suddenly, without warning, the door to that orbit had opened. She picked up the phone before the 48 hours were over and said yes. Cornell Pierce was not a person to her at that point. Not really. He was a mechanism, a key, a way through a wall she had spent 2 years trying to climb. Everything she learned about him reinforced that belief. The headlines described a man spiraling through wealth like gasoline through fire. Parties, fights, business deals he sabotaged out of boredom. A billionaire heir determined to burn through every opportunity handed to him. Summer studied the pattern and thought she understood it. A reckless man was easy to predict, easy to guide, easy to use. She packed one suitcase, her sharpest suits, her most unreadable expressions. Every piece of patience and anger and discipline she had built over the last 3 years folded neatly into the smallest possible emotional space. Then she walked into the Pierce building believing 3 things with absolute certainty. Her plan was solid. Her reasons were just. And Cornell Pierce was simply the door she needed to walk through to reach the man behind him. She was right about 2 of those things, and dangerously wrong about the third. Dan Pierce presented the offer the way men like him present everything. Flat, efficient, stripped of warmth, as if human lives were simply items on a ledger waiting to be moved from one column to another. There was no attempt at persuasion, no dramatic build-up, not even the courtesy of pretending this was unusual. He sat behind a massive desk that looked less like furniture and more like a declaration of territory, hands resting lightly on the polished surface, as though the decision had already been made long before Summer Lawson walked into the room. "Mary Cornell," he said. 6 months. Structured, documented, private. The words fell into the space between them with the quiet finality of a business transaction. In return, he explained, "Sir, there would be a financial settlement large enough to permanently alter her circumstances, the kind of number that quietly rearranges the future of anyone who hears it. More importantly, there would be full professional access to Pierce Holdings as a credentialed consultant, access to internal operations, documents, personnel, meetings, and the kind of proximity to the family's inner workings that Summer had spent 3 years trying to reach from the outside without ever getting close enough to touch." He slid a thin folder across the desk as if he were passing a receipt. Summer opened it. She read every page slowly, carefully, her expression calm and composed, while something deeper inside her shifted into alignment with a clarity so sharp it almost felt physical. 2 years of circling the same locked door, testing every handle, studying every hinge, and suddenly, the door wasn't locked at all. It had simply opened, and the man standing behind it was inviting her inside. When she looked up from the contract, her eyes met Dan Pierce's across the desk. Her voice was steady when she said she would need the afternoon to review the full terms. In truth, she had already made her decision somewhere between the phrase, "access to Pierce Holdings," and the quiet pause that followed it. But she had learned something important during the years she spent watching powerful people from the outside. The most unsettling thing you can do to someone who is used to immediate obedience is to make them wait. Cornell Pierce was in the adjoining room when she stepped inside. She knew instantly that he had already been told. It was there in the set of his shoulders, in the tight line of his crossed arms, in the contained tension of a man exercising careful control over a reaction he had not been allowed to express. He was sitting in a chair angled slightly away from the door, jaw clenched, posture rigid with the kind of quiet resistance that says the argument already happened somewhere else, and he had already lost it. When she entered, he looked at her once. Just once. A quick, efficient glance that traveled over her face and posture in less than 3 seconds. The kind of assessment designed to land like a door shutting. Then, he looked away again, as if she had already been dismissed from consideration. Summer didn't ask for permission before taking the seat across from him. She noticed the exact moment he registered that decision, the smallest shift in his posture, even though his face remained carefully blank. Dan Pierce repeated the arrangement briefly for the room. 6 months. Appearances maintained. Personal matters kept private. Cornell said nothing during the entire explanation. He remained still, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the far wall, while a muscle in his jaw worked slowly beneath the surface like restrained thunder. When the explanation ended, silence filled the room. That was when Cornell finally looked at her properly. Not the quick dismissal from before, but something slower, more deliberate. His eyes moved across her face like someone searching for a weakness hidden in plain sight, the small fracture where confidence breaks and uncertainty begins. "You think you can handle me?" he asked. His voice was low, quiet, stripped of performance. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a joke. It was the simple, direct question of a man who had spent years becoming genuinely difficult and wanted to know whether she understood the full reality of what she was stepping into. Summer held his gaze without blinking. Then she leaned forward slightly, closing just enough distance between them that he could catch the faint trace of her perfume, and she could detect the subtle scent of whiskey buried beneath the expensive fabric of his suit. It was a deliberate movement, the kind that told him she didn't solve discomfort by retreating from it. "I don't need to handle you," she said calmly. Her voice was steady, almost conversational, but there was finality in it that made the air tighten between them. "I just need to outlast you." The room went very still after that. Something moved through Cornell's expression so quickly it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't paying very close attention. It wasn't anger. It wasn't amusement either. It was something deeper and more exposed than either of those reactions, something that flickered across his face like a current beneath water, revealing for a split second that the calm surface wasn't the full story. Then the smirk arrived. Easy, polished, the familiar expression of a man who had spent years learning how to hide the truth behind charm and deflection. "You're interesting," he said slowly. "Mrs. Future Pierce." Summer signed the contract that afternoon. When she stepped outside the building, the sky was a dull gray sheet of November clouds, the kind of color that makes the whole city feel slightly muted. The cold air hit her face as she walked down the front steps, contract tucked neatly into her bag, and she told herself that the moment in that room had meant absolutely nothing. Just tension, just proximity. Just two people measuring each other across a table for the first time. Electricity without meaning, chemistry without consequence. She repeated that explanation to herself the entire ride home, quietly reinforcing the logic of her plan, the way someone checks the locks on a door they have already secured. She had prepared for everything. Every conversation, every manipulation, every possible move Cornell Pierce might make once they were married. What she had not prepared for, what none of her research had warned her about, was the half-second delay before his smirk had appeared. The way his question had sounded less like a challenge and more like a warning. The strange stillness he carried, not the careless stillness of arrogance, but the tight control of someone holding themselves together around something fragile and deeply guarded. She had spent weeks researching Cornell Pierce, assembling a complete portrait of a man seemingly dedicated to dismantling his own life with reckless consistency. She believed she understood the shape of him. But understanding the shape of something and understanding what created that shape are two very different things. And somewhere between that quiet question and the smirk that followed it, Summer Lawson had made the most dangerous miscalculation of her entire plan. She had assumed the enemy would be simple. Cornell Pierce was not simple. And the carefully engineered strategy she had built piece by piece over 3 years, every move calculated, every emotion sealed behind layers of discipline, had just developed its first crack. Small, almost invisible. But Summer knew something about cracks. She knew they never stayed small for long. The wedding took 14 minutes. Summer knew because her mind counted automatically now, the way it had learned to do after years of watching the world carefully, logging details, storing moments the way some people store photographs. 14 minutes from the moment the civil celebrant cleared his throat to the moment the pen touched the final page, and the law decided that Summer Lawson was no longer just Summer Lawson. 14 minutes to become, officially and irrevocably, the wife of Cornell Pierce. There was no cathedral, no music, no aisle, no gathering of smiling faces pretending to witness something sacred. Just a small private room inside a government building that smelled faintly of paper and old wood polish. The celebrant spoke with the calm detachment of a man who had performed the same ritual so many times. The words had long ago stopped carrying weight for him. Two witnesses stood nearby, both from Dan Pierce's legal team, watching with the polite professionalism of people overseeing a contract being finalized. When it was over, they shook hands and nodded and left the room with the quiet efficiency of men who had completed their role in a transaction. Summer wore cream. The dress was simple but deliberate, structured in a way that suggested intention without declaring emotion. It wasn't the kind of dress that announced this moment as meaningless, but it also refused to pretend it was the most important day of her life. It existed somewhere carefully balanced in the middle, neutral and controlled, just like the expression she kept on her face. Cornell wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, immaculate. The only sign that this morning had required any effort from him at all was the fact that he had shaved. Otherwise, he stood beside her as he always stood, still, composed, carrying that same quiet tension she had started to recognize in him. At first, she had mistaken that stillness for arrogance. Now she wasn't so sure. Arrogance is careless. The kind of stillness Cornell carried had discipline in it, control in the way his shoulders held their position and the way his breathing remained measured even in moments where most people would shift or fidget. It looked less like confidence and more like a man containing something. Summer kept her eyes on the celebrant as the vows were spoken. The words felt strangely hollow in the air, legal language wrapped in ceremonial rhythm. She repeated them clearly when asked, her voice steady and calm, her gaze focused forward. And then she made the mistake of glancing sideways during the exchange of rings. Cornell was already looking at her, not at the celebrant, not at the document, not even at the ring resting carefully between his fingers. He was looking directly at her face with an expression that felt almost unfamiliar on him. The usual architecture of his expression was gone. No smirk, no guarded amusement, no clever deflection. Just his eyes searching her quietly, as if he were trying to understand something about her before the moment disappeared. He slid the ring onto her finger slowly with surprising care. As he did, his thumb brushed across her knuckle in one slow, absent movement. The contact lasted less than a second. Barely a touch at all. It should have meant nothing. Just skin meeting skin during the completion of a legal formality. But the sensation moved through her chest like a small electric current finding its way along the shortest path between 2 points. Warm, sudden, entirely unwelcome. Summer dropped her gaze to the ring immediately, pretending to study the thin band of metal now resting against her skin. She told herself it was nerves, the strange vulnerability of standing in a quiet room saying vows in front of strangers, the closeness, the pressure of the moment. She repeated those explanations calmly inside her mind. None of them felt true. The penthouse was silent when they arrived later that afternoon. 42 floors above the city, surrounded by glass on every side, the apartment seemed less like a home and more like a space floating above everything else in the world. The skyline stretched endlessly in every direction, streets glowing faintly as evening approached, buildings rising like quiet monuments to money and power. The ceilings were high enough that the sky almost felt like part of the interior. Every piece of furniture carried the quiet, effortless elegance of things chosen without needing to consider price. Summer had just placed her bag near the entrance when she heard the sound. The quiet, unmistakable pour of whiskey into a glass. She had already learned to recognize that sound over the past few days, the rhythm of it, the pause that followed when he stood still afterward. She walked into the main room because staying in the guest bedroom would have felt like surrendering space she had no intention of surrendering. Cornell stood near the window with his back partly turned, the city lights spreading behind him like a living painting. One lamp cast long shadows across the room, outlining the sharp lines of his shoulders and the dark fabric of his suit. For a moment he looked almost unreal, like something captured in a photograph, rather than a person standing only a few steps away. He turned when he heard her. His eyes moved over her slowly, thoughtfully, as if measuring something he hadn't quite decided how to name yet. Then he spoke. "So tell me, wife?" The word landed between them with deliberate weight, like he was testing the shape of it. His voice was lower than usual, softened slightly by the whiskey in his glass. "Are you afraid of me?" Summer didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crossed the room. Her steps were steady and unhurried, closing the distance between them without hesitation. It wasn't dramatic or confrontational, just a quiet declaration that the space between them didn't belong to him alone. She stopped a short distance away, close enough to feel the warmth of his body cutting through the cool air of the room, close enough to notice the tension sitting quietly in his jaw. "I don't scare easily," she said. For a second, something real moved through his expression, quick, unfiltered. He let out a soft, brief laugh that sounded less like amusement and more like surprise at something landing exactly where he hadn't expected it. Then his hand lifted slowly. He moved carefully, giving her time to step back if she wanted to. Time to break the distance before he crossed it. She didn't move. His fingers touched her chin lightly, tilting her face upward until their eyes met from a distance too close for pretending. His grip was gentle, barely more than a suggestion, but it held her attention completely. His voice dropped until it was almost a whisper. "You should be." The words settled somewhere deep beneath her ribs, warm and heavy. The air between them changed in that moment, the quiet space separating them suddenly charged with something difficult to name. Summer studied his face carefully, looking past the whiskey and the practiced smirk he usually wore like armor. Beneath the surface, she caught a glimpse of something else, something unguarded, something human in a way she had not prepared herself to see. For a moment, he didn't look like the reckless billionaire heir she had researched. He looked like someone lost. The thought startled her more than anything else had that day. Then his hand dropped. The moment disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Cornell stepped back, turning toward the window again as if nothing had happened at all. He said nothing more. The city lights reflected faintly across the glass as silence returned to the room. Summer walked back down the hallway to the guest bedroom assigned to her. She closed the door behind her quietly and leaned back against the wood, standing in the dark while the unfamiliar ring rested cold against her finger. Her hand lifted slowly until her palm pressed flat against her chest, where his words still seemed to linger. She had come here with a clear purpose, a precise plan, a quiet promise to dismantle the family responsible for destroying her own. But standing there in the darkness of a penthouse that didn't belong to her, she realized something with sudden and uncomfortable clarity. The most dangerous part of this arrangement was not the plan she had built. It was him. Not the reckless public version she had studied in headlines. Not the billionaire heir his father described as a problem needing control. The dangerous version of Cornell Pierce was the one she had just glimpsed for a few unguarded seconds in the dim light of the living room. The man behind the walls. The one who looked almost painfully human before remembering to hide it again. That version was the one she had no defenses prepared for. And it was already far too late to pretend she hadn't seen him. She had known, going in, that living with Cornell Pierce would be difficult. She had prepared for difficult. Had mapped out every version of difficult she could imagine. The hostility, the resistance, the deliberate obstruction of someone who had not chosen this arrangement and had no intention of pretending otherwise. She had built contingencies for all of it. What she had not built a contingency for was this. Cornell Pierce lived at a frequency that most people couldn't sustain for a week, let alone as a permanent state of existence. The penthouse was a base camp, not a home, a place he returned to briefly between the things that actually occupied him. Street circuits at midnight with men who had too much money and too little fear. Business meetings that lasted 40 minutes and somehow moved 9 figures. A social calendar that looked, from the outside, like a man who loved being everywhere and was, she was slowly beginning to understand, actually a man who needed to stay in motion because stopping meant feeling something he had decided not to feel. She watched him the way she watched everything, carefully, from a slight distance, filing every detail. And she noticed something that didn't fit the profile she had built. When other women entered his orbit, and they did, constantly, with the specific confidence of people who had never once been told no, Cornell was present in body and somewhere else, entirely in attention. Polite in the mechanical way of someone fulfilling a social obligation. Disengaged in the specific way of someone whose mind had already moved to the next room. But when Summer entered a room, any room, his eyes found her. Not dramatically, not obviously, just quietly and immediately, the way a compass finds north. Like her presence in a space recalibrated something in him that he hadn't necessarily given permission to be recalibrated. She told herself she was imagining it. The gala was on a Friday in the 3rd week. A Pierce Holdings philanthropy event, the kind of evening that costs more to host than most people earn in a decade and exists primarily to remind the city's power structure who sits at the top of it. Champagne and string quartets, and the particular performance of wealth that has learned to dress itself in generosity. Summer wore black, simple and precise. She was there to observe, to map the relationships in that room, to identify who spoke to Dan Pierce privately and who avoided him, and what the gap between those two categories might contain. She was doing exactly that when she saw the woman. Beautiful. Deliberately so. The kind of woman who enters events like this with the quiet certainty that she is the most interesting thing in any space she occupies. She had found Cornell within minutes of arriving, had moved to his side with the ease of someone who had occupied that position before and considered it naturally hers, and draped herself against his arm with a familiarity that made Summer's jaw tighten before she could instruct it not to. She looked away, focused on the room, on the faces, on the work, and felt, without looking, without being able to explain the mechanism of it, that she was being watched. She looked up. Cornell was across the room with the woman still at his side, her hand on his arm, her attention entirely on him. He was not looking at her. His eyes were steady and direct and fixed completely across the room. On Summer. Not a glance. Not a passing look. a deliberate, unhurried gaze that didn't shift when she met it. And that stayed, patient and unblinking, and carrying something she couldn't decode from this distance, while the woman beside him continued speaking to a profile that had stopped listening. Then, without looking down, without a word, Cornell lifted the woman's hand from his arm and removed it. Clean and final. Set it aside like something that had been placed where it didn't belong, and walked across the room. She watched him come, kept her expression neutral through what required genuine effort. He moved through that crowd the way he moved through every space, like the room had been arranged around him rather than the other way around. He reached her, stopped close, always, always that precise distance that was too deliberate to be accidental. Leaned down slightly so that when he spoke, his voice arrived at her ear rather than across it. "Are you jealous?" Her pulse moved before she could stop it. A single, each traitorous spike that she felt in her throat and prayed didn't show in her face. "No," she said. Even. Flat. Convincing enough, she hoped. She felt more than saw the smirk. Then his hand settled at her waist, warm and certain, and with the quiet authority of someone who had decided something without announcing it. His palm pressed lightly against the small of her back, and she felt it travel all the way up her spine and had to concentrate, specifically and deliberately, on keeping her breathing even. Good. His voice was low enough that it belonged only to her. "Because I don't share what's mine." Mine. The word landed and stayed. It should have made her angry. The possessiveness of it, the presumption, the casual certainty that she was something he could claim. She had a list of reasons it should have made her angry, and she ran through them quickly and efficiently in the 3 seconds that followed. None of them worked. Because underneath the anger she reached for, and couldn't quite close her hand around, underneath the reminder that this was strategy, that his hand on her waist was performance, that mine was a word deployed by a man playing a role in a room full of people he wanted to impress. Her heart had done something small and involuntary and entirely inconvenient. It had responded. Not to the word, not to the performance, to the way he had removed that woman's hand without looking at her and walked across a crowded room like there was only one direction worth moving in. She stared straight ahead at the room full of people and kept her face still, and felt his hand warm against her back, and understood, with the particular clarity of someone watching a wall develop a crack they cannot stop, that the distance she needed to maintain between herself and this man was becoming something she had to work at. And things you have to work at have a way of eventually giving way. She heard him at 2 a.m. Not loudly. That was the thing that pulled her out of sleep, rather than jolting her from it. Not a crash or a shout, or the kind of sound that announces itself. Just a voice, low and fractured, coming through the wall between their rooms like something that had been trying to stay contained and finally couldn't. She lay still for a moment, listened. It came again. She was out of bed before she made the conscious decision to move. The hallway was dark. The penthouse held its nighttime silence, that particular quality of quiet that belongs to high floors, above the city's noise, where the only sounds are the ones you bring with you. She moved toward his door and stopped outside it and stood there with her hand raised and her knuckles an inch from the wood. She could hear him breathing, ragged and uneven, and then, beneath it, a word. The same word. He repeated, barely audible. The sound of someone speaking to a person who wasn't in the room. Lily. She opened the door. Cornell was on the bed, on top of the covers, still dressed from the evening. His shirt was dark with sweat. His hands were gripping the sheets on either side of him with the white-knuckled tension of someone bracing against something. Not a physical force, but an interior one, the kind that doesn't respond to bracing but keeps coming anyway. His face was turned to the side. his jaw working, his eyes moving fast beneath closed lids through something he couldn't get out of. Summer stood in the doorway and watched the most controlled man she had ever encountered come completely undone in his sleep. She had read about Lily Pierce, a single paragraph in a 2-year-old profile, the kind of mention that gets included for completeness and then never expanded on. Cornell's younger sister died 5 years ago. A car accident on a November road. The family had not spoken publicly about it. There were no charitable foundations named in her honor, no annual statements, none of the public grief architecture that wealthy families usually construct around their losses. Just silence. The kind of silence that isn't peace. The kind that gets built around something too heavy and too complicated to display. She understood that kind of silence. She crossed the room quietly and sat on the edge of the bed. Not close enough to touch him. Just present. A body in the room, a small human interruption to whatever was pulling him under. He didn't wake up, but something in him shifted. Some deep and non-conscious part of him that was beyond the nightmare registered that the air in the room had changed, that he was not alone. His breathing slowed, not immediately, not completely, but by degrees. The tension in his hands loosened slightly, and then his hand moved across the sheet, found hers, without opening his eyes, without waking. But without any awareness, she was certain of who she was or that she was there at all. Just a reaching toward warmth in the dark, the oldest and most human of instincts, the thing that exists in people before language and after everything else falls away. His fingers closed around hers, tightly, with the specific grip of someone holding on because letting go is not an option. She sat very still and let him hold her hand and stared at the wall across the room and felt something she had been carefully, methodically, and successfully suppressing for weeks begin to move in her chest like a tide that had decided the shore was non-negotiable. She had built her picture of Cornell Pierce from the outside, had assembled him from tabloid headlines and corporate profiles and the visible wreckage of a man who seemed dedicated to his own destruction. She had categorized him, filed him, reduced him to a function in a plan because that was the only way to be in the same building as him without the plan becoming complicated. But this was not the reckless air. This was not the smirk or the whiskey or the hand at her waist at a gala with a word like mine delivered into her ear like a challenge. This was a man who had been driving the car. She didn't know all of it yet. The full shape of that night, the wet November road, the sister who hadn't come home. She would learn the details later, in pieces, from sources who spoke carefully, and a family that had built its grief into a wall so solid nobody spoke about what was on the other side. But she didn't need the details to understand what she was looking at. She recognized it. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying the weight of an absence they believe they caused. The way it doesn't heal. It just gets incorporated. Becomes structural. It becomes the reason a person makes themselves unreachable, because if you are already nothing, then there is nothing left to lose. She had worn that face in the mirror, not for the same reason, but the weight. The exact specific gravity of believing that surviving something makes you responsible for it, that she knew by heart. His grip on her hand didn't loosen until just before dawn. She sat there the entire time. And somewhere in those dark-ish quiet hours, with his hand in hers and the city sleeping 40 floors below, and the name Lily still hanging in the air of the room like something that had never been properly released, the architecture of Summer's plan developed a fracture so fundamental she felt it the moment it formed. Not in the plan itself. The plan was still there. The evidence, the goal, the promise she had made at 2 graves in the rain that she had never once stopped intending to keep. The fracture was somewhere else. In the part of her that had just spent 4 hours sitting beside a man in the dark because she could not make herself leave. In the part that already knew, quietly, inconveniently, with the terrible certainty of something that cannot be unfelt once it has been felt. That Cornell Pierce was not the man she had come here to find, and that the man she had actually found was going to cost her something she hadn't included in any version of the plan. The change in Cornell was not dramatic. That was what made it so hard to defend against. If it had been sudden, some overnight transformation, a declaration, a grand gesture of the kind that announces itself and gives you time to prepare a response, she could have handled it, could have filed it under performance, under strategy, under the behavior of a man who had been told to reform and was finally, belatedly, going through the motions. But it wasn't sudden. It was slow, incremental. The kind of change that happens in the spaces between moments, that you only notice when you look back and realize the person standing in front of you is no longer the person you cataloged 3 weeks ago. The whiskey glass appeared less. She noticed without meaning to, the way it had been a fixture of every evening and then gradually became an occasional presence, and then, one week, was simply not there. No announcement, no declaration of effort, just its absence, quiet and deliberate. He started appearing at the office, not for the board meetings his father scheduled and he had historically treated as optional, but for smaller things. Strategic reviews, team briefings, conversations with department heads that served no performative purpose because no one significant enough to impress was watching. He was doing the work. Actual, unglamorous, nobody is photographing this work. And when he came home in the evenings, he was different in a way she couldn't immediately name, less armored, somehow. Like the effort of showing up somewhere real had loosened something in the architecture he kept around himself. He ate dinner at the table instead of standing at the window. He asked her questions. Not about the assignment, not about the company, about her. Small things. And the kind of questions that have no strategic value and exist only because someone is genuinely curious about the answer. She answered carefully, gave him the true edges of things without the centers. Enough to be believable, not enough to be vulnerable. She told herself that was still working. The night in his office happened on a Thursday. She noticed, the way she always noticed Thursdays, 3 weeks after the gala. She had stayed late going through corporate restructuring documents she had legitimate access to and was using quietly to map the financial architecture of a company that had been very careful about what it made visible from the outside. She didn't hear him come in. He was simply there, leaning in the doorway with his jacket gone and his sleeves rolled to the elbow and the city spread out behind him through the glass wall like a backdrop that kept insisting on being cinematic regardless of the situation. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he crossed the room and stopped in front of her desk, and the way he was looking at her, steady and direct, and stripped of every layer of deflection he usually kept between himself and the world, made her very aware of how small the distance between them actually was. "Why are you really here, Summer?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Her heart rate spiked. One sharp, an immediate climb that she felt in her throat and her fingertips, and the hand that was very carefully not moving on the desk in front of her. Because this was the question she had prepared for, had rehearsed her response to, had built a version of the truth that was close enough to be convincing and far enough to be safe. But the way he was asking it, he wasn't suspicious. He wasn't interrogating. He was asking the way people ask questions when they are standing at the edge of something and need to know the ground is real before they step onto it. He was asking because he needed the answer to matter. She opened her mouth, and he stepped closer. His hand lifted and his fingers moved a strand of hair from her face, the lightest touch, barely contact, but warm and deliberate, and so unbearably careful that her breath stopped entirely for a moment and simply forgot to restart. "You drive me insane," he said quietly. She looked up at him, found his eyes already on hers, closer now than they had ever been in a moment that wasn't performance, that had no audience, that existed only in the private space between two people at the end of a long day in an empty office with the city glittering behind them. Good insane? She asked. Something moved across his face, and then he smiled. Not the smirk, not the practiced, deflecting, he keeps everyone at a safe distance expression she had catalogued in the first week. This was something else entirely. Slower and quieter, and reaching all the way to his eyes in a way that transformed the whole architecture of his face into something that felt, for the first time, completely unguarded. The kind of smile that doesn't know it's dangerous because it isn't trying to be. The worst kind, he said. And then he kissed her. Slow, careful. The way you touch something you're not entirely sure is real. With a gentleness that has caution woven through it, that is asking a question even as it answers one. Like he was afraid that any sudden movement would end it. Like she was something that required handling with more care than he had given anything in a very long time. She kissed him back. And somewhere in the space between his mouth and hers, in that warm and quiet and completely unplanned moment in an office full of documents that were slowly building a case against his family, Summer Lawson's plan met the one variable she had never once accounted for. Not his resistance, not his damage, not the complexity of a man she had misjudged completely, her own heart. She pulled back first, looked at him. His eyes were open and steady and holding something she recognized with a clarity that arrived like cold water, because she had felt it in herself at 2 a.m. in a dark hallway, and sitting at the edge of his bed with his hand in hers, and every quiet dinner and every question he had asked that had no strategic value. It was trust. Cornell Pierce, who trusted nothing and no one, who had spent 5 years dismantling every bridge between himself and the world, was looking at her like she was the first solid ground he had found, and she was standing on it with a secret buried in her pocket that would crack it apart the moment it surfaced. She looked at his face, open and real and more vulnerable than she had ever seen it, and felt the full and terrible weight of what she was doing land on her chest like something physical. Revenge had been clean once, purposeful, and the only thing she was certain of in a life that grief had stripped of certainty. It didn't feel clean anymore. It felt like a debt she owed the dead that she was going to have to pay with something that belonged to the living. And standing there in the dark of his office with his eyes on her face and the city silent behind him, Summer understood that she had passed the point where any version of this ended without cost. The only question left was who was going to pay it. Julian Pierce found her on a Tuesday evening in the East Corridor, 3 doors from her room. She had been coming back from the study, late, later than usual, with her laptop bag over one shoulder and her mind still moving through the financial thread she had been following for the past week. A payment structure buried inside a subsidiary company that connected, if you traced it carefully enough, through 3 layers of corporate architecture, and to the site contractor responsible for the Hargrove Street development. She had been close, closer than she had ever been. She didn't hear him until he was already there. Julian was 2 years older than Cornell and built from entirely different material. Where Cornell's edges were visible, the damage worn openly, the walls you could see and therefore navigate, Julian was smooth, composed. The kind of man who had learned early that the most effective way to be dangerous is to never look it. He had their father's eyes and none of their father's occasional grudging directness. He smiled the way contracts smile, warmly and entirely without meaning it. He was leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets like he had been waiting, like he had all evening and nowhere else to be. She stopped. The corridor was empty. The house staff had finished for the night. The penthouse beyond was quiet in the specific way that means you are genuinely alone with whatever is in the room with you. "You married him to destroy us," Julian said. Not a question, Not an accusation building toward something. Just a statement, delivered with the flat precision of someone reading from a document they have already reviewed thoroughly. He smiled. The smile didn't reach anything above his mouth. "I've been through your files," he said quietly. "The ones on the secure drive. Yeesh, the corporate records, the witness contacts, the evidence trail you've been building since before you walked through our door." He tilted his head slightly. "You've been quite thorough. Your father would have been proud, structurally speaking." The mention of her father landed like a physical blow. She absorbed it without flinching and hated him for it. "If Cornell finds out what you actually came here for," Julian continued, "he will never recover from it. You understand that, don't you? The man has spent 5 years trying to find one thing in the world that he hasn't already destroyed or that hasn't already left him." He paused. "Let that sit." "And then you walked in." She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't hand him something he could use. "I want you gone," he said, simply, like it was a scheduling matter. "Resign. Discredit Cornell publicly on your way out. Something that satisfies the board's concerns permanently. And then disappear. If you do that, Cornell never hears a word of this from me." The smile again. "If you don't, I'll tell him everything. Every document. Every contact. Every reason you said yes to this arrangement." He pushed off the wall, straightened his jacket. "Your choice. You have 48 hours. He walked past her without looking back. She stood in the corridor alone and felt the walls of the life she had constructed very carefully over the past months develop simultaneous cracks in every direction at once. She made it to her room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and tried to find the part of herself that had walked into this building certain and clear and unafraid. The part that had a plan, a corkboard, a red string, a promise made at 2 graves in the rain. She couldn't locate it. What she found instead was Cornell's face, the smile in his office that had reached all the way to his eyes, his hand finding hers in the dark without knowing it was hers, and the way he had started showing up, to work, to dinner, to the small and ordinary moments of a shared life, like a man slowly, carefully, against his own better judgment, deciding that existing was worth the effort again. She had done that. Somewhere in the middle of the plan, in the space between strategy and proximity, and 2 people sitting in the dark with nothing left to perform. She had become the reason Cornell Pierce had started to come back to himself. And Julian knew it. That was the cruelty of it. Not that he had found the evidence. She had always known that was a risk, had built contingencies, had run the scenario in her mind. The cruelty was the timing, the precise and surgical accuracy of discovering her secret at the exact moment when the secret had the most possible damage to do. She was still sitting there when the door opened. Cornell didn't knock. He never did. She had noticed that. The way he moved through spaces with the assumption of welcome that she had initially read as arrogance and now understood was something closer to the opposite. A man who had spent so long being unwanted in his own home that he had stopped knowing how to ask permission to enter it. He saw her immediately. The dark room. Her on the edge of the bed. The particular quality of stillness that belongs only to someone who has been crying and has run out of it. He crossed the room without hesitation and pulled her in. No preamble, no question first. Just his arms around her, immediate and certain, one hand at the back of her head and her face against his chest, and the warm, solid reality of him surrounding her before she had any capacity to redirect it or hold herself apart from it. "Who hurt you?" he said. Low, direct. The voice of a man who had already decided that whatever the answer was, it mattered, and he was not leaving until he had it. She closed her eyes, felt his heartbeat beneath her cheek, steady and real, and the warmth of his hand at the back of her head, and the way he was holding her like she was something worth protecting. Fiercely, without hesitation, with the specific and devastating tenderness of a man who doesn't do this often and means it completely when he does. And the answer to his question pressed against the inside of her chest like a secret trying to get out through a door she was holding shut with everything she had left. Who hurt you? She had an answer he wasn't expecting. Because the person who was going to hurt him most, who had already hurt him, in ways he didn't know yet, in ways that would land like a demolition when the truth finally arrived, was not Julian. It was not his father. It was the woman he was currently holding like she was the only thing in the room worth holding on to. It was her, and she knew it. And she held on to him anyway, because she was not strong enough in that moment to do anything else, and felt the full weight of what she had become inside a plan that had made perfect sense until the plan became a person. 48 hours. That was what Julian had given her. But standing there in Cornell's arms in the dark, she already knew that the 48 hours didn't matter, because she wasn't going to let Julian be the one to tell him. Whatever happened next, whatever it cost her, and whatever it broke, Cornell Pierce was going to hear the truth from her, not as a strategy, not as damage control, but because he deserved it. And because the woman who had walked into this building with a plan and a corkboard and a promise she intended to keep had somewhere along the way become someone who could not look at this man and choose anything other than honesty, even if honesty was the thing that ended everything. She told him on a Wednesday night. Not because Wednesday was significant, but because she woke that morning and understood, with the quiet finality of a decision that has actually already been made and is simply waiting to be acted on, that she could not spend another day inside the life they had built together, carrying something that made it a lie. Cornell was in the main room when she came out, standing at the window in the way he sometimes stood in the evenings, not looking at anything specific, just present with the city and the dark and whatever was moving through him that he hadn't found words for yet. He had a glass of water. She noticed that. Water, not whiskey. She had noticed the shift weeks ago and had felt something move in her chest about it that she hadn't allowed herself to examine. She examined it now, filed it away with everything else she was about to hand him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He turned, read her face in the way he had become very good at reading her face, quickly, thoroughly, with the attention of someone who had decided that what showed in her expression mattered to him. He set the glass down, and she told him. All of it. Her parents, the site on Hargrove Street, the 11-day investigation that had been redirected before it found anything real, the settlement she had signed too young and too broken to understand, the 2 years of building evidence from the outside. The call that had come on a Thursday evening from a recruitment agency representing his father. The decision she had made in 48 hours standing in front of a corkboard with her parents' names at one end of a red string and his father's name at the other. She told him what he had been to her when she walked in. The mechanism. The door. The key to a room she had spent years trying to get inside. She told him when it changed. Not dramatically. She didn't dress it up. Just the truth of it. Plain and chronological. The nightmares. His hand finding hers in the dark. The gala and the woman, and the way he had walked across the room like there was only one direction. The office. The smile that had reached all the way to his eyes. She told him about Julian, the corridor, the 48 hours. And then she stopped. And the silence that followed was the heaviest thing she had ever stood inside. Cornell had not moved through any of it. Had stood completely still with his eyes on her face and an expression she could not read, could not find the edges of, could not locate herself within. And she had kept talking into that stillness because stopping felt like the one thing she absolutely could not do. Now she had stopped, and he was still looking at her. The silence stretched, long enough that she felt every second of it in her sternum. Long enough that the city outside continued its indifferent movement, and the room held its breath around them, and Summer stood with her hands still at her sides, and her chin level, and the remnants of 3 years of carefully maintained composure doing the only thing left available to it, holding the outside together, while the inside came completely apart. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of everything except the weight of what he was saying. "You used me." The words landed exactly as she had known they would, clean and direct and irrefutable. Not a question. Not an accusation designed to wound. Just a fact being named by a man who deserved to name it. She felt them move through her like something structural giving way, like a wall she had been leaning on for so long she had forgotten it was also holding her up. She lifted her chin. Because she was not going to look away from this. Had not come this far. Had not made this choice. To flinch from the consequences of it. "I never lied about loving you," she said. It was the truest sentence she had spoken in this room. Maybe in this entire arrangement. Maybe in longer than that. Another silence. Different from the first one. The first had been the silence of a man absorbing impact. This one had a different quality. Charged and moving, like the air before weather arrives. Cornell crossed the room. Not quickly. Not with the loose, unhurried ease he wore in public. And with intention. Each step deliberate. Each step closing the distance between them until he was standing directly in front of her. Close enough that she had to hold herself very still to keep from moving back. His hand came up. Cupped her face. Rough and gentle simultaneously. The hands of a man who had spent years at the edges of things that required force, and was now holding something that required the opposite. His thumb moved once across her cheekbone. His palm was warm against her jaw, and she felt it in every nerve ending she had, and kept her eyes on his, and waited for whatever came next, with her heart completely exposed and nowhere left to hide. "You idiot," he whispered. She stared at him. Something in his expression, beneath the rawness of it, beneath the damage she had put there and the damage that had been there long before her, was breaking open into something else. Something she recognized the shape of because she had been carrying it herself for weeks, in the space between her ribs where the plan used to live. Her heart stopped. Completely. One full suspended beat. "Did you really think," he said quietly, "that I wouldn't fall in love with you too?" The words arrived and dismantled everything. Every wall. Every contingency. Every carefully maintained distance between what she had come here to do and what she had actually done. 3 years of grief and strategy and the particular loneliness of a person who has made themselves into a weapon and forgotten, somewhere along the way, that weapons don't get to also be people. She felt her face do something she hadn't planned, something she hadn't done in front of another person in a very long time. His forehead came down to hers, his hand still cupping her jaw, his eyes closed. And they stood like that in the quiet of the room, with the city moving below them and everything broken and everything still somehow impossibly intact. Two people who had come to each other through the worst possible door and found, on the other side of it, the one thing neither of them had believed they were still allowed to have. Something real. Something that had grown in the dark of a fake marriage and a hidden plan, and two people who were supposed to be using each other, and had, instead, without permission, without planning, against every reasonable expectation, saved each other. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Some things don't need words. Some things are complete in exactly the form they arrive in. Two people standing in the wreckage of a plan and a secret, and 5 years of separate grief, holding on to each other in the dark, choosing this over everything easier. The plan was gone. What remained was the only thing that had ever been real in that room. And, for the first time in 3 years, Summer Lawson let herself feel it without flinching. The truth came out the way truth always does when it has been held down long enough. Not with a dramatic unraveling, but with the quiet, inevitable pressure of something that was never actually containable, only delayed. Cornell was the one who went to his father. Not with Summer's evidence, though she had offered it. We had laid everything she had built across 3 years on the table between them the morning after she told him everything, had placed the drive and the documents and the witness contacts in front of him with steady hands and told him it was his now, to do with as he chose. That it had always been going to belong to whatever version of justice presented itself, that she was done deciding unilaterally what that looked like. He had looked at the drive for a long time without touching it, and then he had picked it up and gone to find his father. She didn't know exactly what passed between them in that room. Cornell didn't reconstruct it for her in detail, and she didn't ask, understood instinctively that whatever had happened there belonged to the two of them in the specific way that things belong to fathers and sons, tangled and painful and irreducible to summary. What she knew was that Cornell went in alone and came out 2 hours later and stood in the hallway outside his father's office for a moment with his eyes closed and his hand flat against the wall, and something in his face that looked like a man setting something down after carrying it for so long he had forgotten what his own hands felt like, empty. Dan Pierce made a statement 4 days later. His legal team framed it carefully. As a voluntary disclosure, a corporate accountability measure, see a family decision to acknowledge historical failures in the Hargrove Street development and the subsequent handling of its consequences. The language was precise and limited, and clearly the work of people paid to minimize while technically telling the truth. But it was there, in writing, his name on it. The cover-up acknowledged, the safety failures named, the settlements that had followed described, obliquely, as inadequate and improperly conditioned. It was not everything Summer had wanted when she had stood at 2 graves in the rain and made her promise. It was not a criminal proceeding. It was not the full and unqualified reckoning she had spent 3 years building toward. But her parents' names were no longer attached to the word accident. And Dan Pierce's name was attached to the word responsible. She sat with that for a long time. In her apartment, the small one, the one with the corkboard. On the evening the statement was released. She had gone back there alone, needing the specific solitude of a space that had witnessed the beginning of this, that had held her at 2 a.m. through years of cold coffee and red string, and the particular exhaustion of a person running on grief and intention. She sat in front of the corkboard and took the red string down, not violently, not with ceremony, just carefully, methodically, the way you dismantle something that has served its purpose, with respect for what it was, and clarity about what it no longer needs to be. She was still sitting there when Cornell arrived. He had known where to find her. She hadn't told him. He had simply known, the way he had developed a quiet and uncanny ability to know where she was when she needed to be somewhere alone. He came in without knocking, because he never knocked. Aaron sat down beside her on the floor in front of the empty corkboard without a word. They sat in the quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. Then his arm came around her, drew her in against his side with the easy certainty of someone for whom this had become natural. Not a gesture, not a decision, just the automatic movement of a body that had decided where it belonged. "You married me for revenge," he said. His voice was quiet, not an accusation, not a wound being pressed. Just a fact being named between two people who had earned the right to name things plainly. She nodded against his shoulder. She felt rather than saw the smile move through him. "But you're staying for love." Not a question. The particular confidence of a man who has learned, slowly and against considerable resistance, to trust what is real when it is standing directly in front of him. She looked up at him. At the face she had studied first as a subject, and then as a complication, and then, without planning to and without permission, and with the absolute irreversibility of something that happens below the level of decision, as home. Yes, she said. He kissed her. And this time there was nothing underneath it. No contract. No strategy. No version of either of them performing something for an audience or a purpose or a plan that had long since stopped being the point. Just his mouth on hers in the quiet of a small apartment with an empty corkboard on the wall, and the city outside continuing its ordinary business entirely indifferent to the fact that something extraordinary was happening on the other side of the glass. Something that had grown in the most inhospitable possible conditions. In grief and deception and a fake marriage built on a revenge plan, and had survived all of it. Not because it was easy, not because either of them had been trying to find it, but because some things are stubborn in the way that only real things are stubborn. They persist through every reason not to. They outlast the plans made before they existed. They remain when everything constructed around them has been taken apart piece by piece until only the truth is left standing. And the truth, the plain, unstrategic, unplanned truth, was this. Two people who had each spent years believing they were not allowed to have anything good had, somehow, in spite of everything, found each other. And they were keeping each other. No conditions, no contracts, no expiration date written into any clause of any document in any folder on any desk. Just a future, unexpected, unplanned, built on the ruins of a revenge that had run out of room to be anything other than love. And outside the window, the city moved on. And the lamp flickered once, the way it always had. And Summer Lawson sat in Cornell Pierce's arms in the apartment where the plan had started, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the specific and irreplaceable lightness of a person who has finally, completely, put something down. Not the love for her parents, that she would carry always, not as weight, but as foundation, as the ground beneath everything she was and everything she chose. But the grief that had curdled into mission, the loneliness of a person who had made themselves into a single sharp point, aimed at a single target and forgotten to leave room for anything else, that she put down. And in its place, warm and solid and entirely unplanned, was this, was him, was the future neither of them had seen coming and both of them finally were ready to meet.